Somewhere on Earth right now, there are more than 8 billion people. Cities span entire coastlines. Networks of humans stretch across every continent except one. And yet, according to some scientists, all of it, every person you have ever met, every language ever spoken, every civilization ever built, can be traced back to a population so small it could have fit inside a single stadium. Not a metaphor, a real number. Somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding adults. That's it. That is the bottleneck your entire species may have passed through. The question is what almost erased them. And the leading suspect is a mountain most people have never heard of. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano called Toba erupted with a force that modern volcanology struggles to fully comprehend. This wasn't an eruption like Vesuvius or even Krakatoa. Geologists classify it as a supervolcanic event, one of the largest in the last 2.5 million years. Toba ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that is enough to bury an area the size of the United States under more than a foot of ash. Ash rained down across South Asia in layers thick enough that geologists can still find them today, sometimes 6 meters deep, in India, more than 2,000 kilometers from the eruption site. Sunlight would have dimmed. Temperatures, according to some models, may have dropped by several degrees for years afterward, a phenomenon sometimes called volcanic winter. Now here is where the story gets personal, because this eruption happened right in the middle of a critical chapter of human history. Homo sapiens had already evolved in Africa. Small groups were beginning to spread. And then, according to geneticists studying human DNA decades later, something happened to the population that looks exactly like a bottleneck. In 1998, geologist Stanley Ambrose, working out of the University of Illinois, published a theory that connected these two facts. He proposed that the Toba eruption triggered a volcanic winter severe enough to collapse food webs across Africa and Asia, driving human populations to the edge of extinction. Ambrose pointed to genetic studies from researchers like Lynn Jord and Henry Harpending, whose work on human genetic diversity found something strange. Compared to other great apes, humans show remarkably low genetic variation, as if our entire species descended from a surprisingly small founding group. Chimpanzees, despite having a smaller total population than humans today, show more genetic diversity between different chimp communities than exists across the entire human species. Think about that. Every human on Earth, no matter where their ancestors came from, is genetically more similar to every other human than one group of wild chimpanzees is to another group living just a few valleys away. That kind of genetic uniformity is exactly what you would expect if at some point in the past, the human population crashed down to a tiny number of survivors, and everyone alive today descended from that narrow surviving line. This became known as the Toba catastrophe theory, and it painted a haunting picture. Imagine small scattered bands of early humans, already struggling to survive predators, disease and each other, suddenly facing years of ash-choked skies, dying vegetation, and failing prey animals. Entire regional populations may have blinked out entirely. According to the most dramatic versions of this theory, the total surviving human population worldwide may have dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals, a number small enough that a single bad flu season today could statistically wipe out a comparable population by chance alone. For years, this idea spread through documentaries and textbooks as though it were settled fact. Humanity nearly went extinct. One eruption, one volcanic winter, one species, hanging by a genetic thread. The theory did not stop at Africa's borders. Ambrose and later researchers pointed out that Toba's fingerprints seemed to show up everywhere humans were living at the time. Genetic studies of Neanderthal populations in Europe also hinted at a population squeeze around the same era, though the causes there remain far more debated. Some researchers even speculated that the eruption might have thinned out multiple hominin species at once, reshuffling the entire human family tree in a single catastrophic season. For a while, Toba became the tidy explanation for almost every mysterious gap and bottleneck showing up across the ancient genetic record. A single volcanic villain tying together loose threads from 3 different continents. But here is the counterintuitive twist, the part most retellings of this story leave out entirely. Archaeologist Curtis Moran, from Arizona State University, has spent years excavating a site called Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa. This site sits directly in the window of time surrounding the Toba eruption. If Ambrose's most severe version of the catastrophe theory were correct, you would expect to find a gap in the archaeological record here, a period where human activity simply stops. Moran's team found the opposite: continuous occupation. Layer after layer of tools, hearths, and evidence of shellfish harvesting, sitting right through the period when Toba's ash should have been darkening the skies. Similar continuity has since been found at multiple sites across Africa, including inland locations far from the coastal buffering effect of the ocean. Whatever hardship Toba caused, it did not appear to erase human life at Pinnacle Point. Even more striking, in 2013, researchers working at Lake Malawi in East Africa found sediment cores that let them reconstruct ancient rainfall and vegetation patterns with remarkable precision. If Toba had triggered a catastrophic, years-long volcanic winter severe enough to collapse African ecosystems, that signal should show up clearly in the lake's geological record. It didn't. The vegetation around Lake Malawi barely changed at all across the Toba event. Other lines of evidence complicated the picture further. Volcanic ash from Toba, sometimes called the youngest Toba tuff, has been found in deep-sea sediment cores and in a lake bed in India, allowing scientists to date the eruption with unusual precision. But when researchers cross-referenced those ash layers against nearby archaeological sites in India, they found stone tools both above and below the ash, made using the same basic techniques, with no obvious disruption in style or sophistication. If the eruption had wiped out entire regional populations, you might expect a visible gap or a shift in tool technology as survivors adapted or as new groups moved in. Instead, the record looked almost stubbornly continuous. So which is it? Did Toba nearly erase humanity, or did our ancestors barely notice? The most recent research suggests both stories were partly right and partly wrong, which is often how real science actually works. The genetic bottleneck almost certainly happened. Multiple independent studies of human DNA, going back decades, keep finding that same signature of a small founding population sometime in our deep past. Early mitochondrial DNA research in the 1980s, associated with geneticist Rebecca Cann and colleagues, first traced all living humans back to a relatively recent common maternal ancestor in Africa, a finding popularized as mitochondrial Eve. That discovery alone hinted that our species had passed through some kind of genetic narrowing. But newer genetic work has started to question the exact timing of that narrowing. Some studies now suggest the sharpest part of the bottleneck may have occurred slightly before or after the Toba eruption itself, driven less by a single volcanic event and more by a combination of factors: climate shifts, population dynamics, and the sheer difficulty of surviving as a small, scattered species during the Ice Age. In other words, Toba may not have been the single dramatic villain of the story. It may have been one severe stressor among several, landing on a species that was already living close to the edge, for reasons that had nothing to do with any one eruption at all. Let's reconstruct what that edge might have actually looked like. Picture small clusters of early Homo sapiens, spread thinly across Africa, most groups numbering in the dozens, not thousands. No stored food surplus, no long-distance trade networks to lean on if local resources failed. A single bad drought, a single collapsed hunting ground, could push an isolated band toward starvation with no outside help coming. Now add ash. Add cooler temperatures, Add years of reduced sunlight stressing the plants that herbivores depended on, and the predators and humans who depended on those herbivores in turn. You don't need every human on Earth to die for a bottleneck to appear in the genetic record. You just need most isolated regional populations to fail, while a small number of resilient, resourceful, perhaps coastal groups, like the ones at Pinnacle Point with year-round access to shellfish, manage to hold on. Survive long enough and your descendants become the ancestors of nearly everyone alive today, simply because the alternative lines quietly disappeared. This is the real shape of a near-extinction event. Not a single dramatic apocalypse wiping out everyone at once, but a slow, grinding filter, removing population after population, until only a handful of lucky, adaptable groups remain standing on the other side. Some researchers now argue this filter had less to do with the ash falling from the sky and more to do with what came after it. Years of cooler, drier conditions across Africa could have shrunk grasslands, shifted rainfall patterns, and squeezed already fragile ecosystems for a generation or longer, even without a single catastrophic winter. That slower, grinding pressure fits the archaeological evidence better than a sudden apocalypse, because a sudden apocalypse tends to leave sudden gaps, and the gaps that would prove it simply are not showing up in most excavated sites. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, of the Natural History Museum in London, has pointed out that the bigger, more reliable pattern in the human fossil and genetic record is not one single crisis, but a long series of population expansions and contractions stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, tied to shifting African climates long before and long after Toba erupted. Toba may simply be the most visible, most datable marker sitting inside a much longer story of a species that spent most of its existence teetering on the edge of local extinction, over and over again, for reasons scientists are still piecing together one site at a time. It helps to compare Toba against other supervolcanic events scientists have studied since. The Yellowstone caldera in North America has erupted at a similar scale multiple times in the deep past, and researchers who study its ash layers have found comparable patterns: short-term climate disruption, followed by ecosystems recovering faster than early models predicted. Volcanic winters are real, but they tend to be shorter and patchier than the popular imagination assumes, with some regions hit hard while others, shielded by ocean currents or simple geographic luck, barely feel the effect at all. That regional patchiness may be exactly why Pinnacle Point kept its people while other, less fortunate populations further inland may have quietly vanished from the record entirely, leaving no fossils behind to tell their side of the story. This is also why paleoanthropologists are cautious about treating any single site as the final word. Absence of evidence at one location is not evidence of absence everywhere. It is entirely possible that Toba devastated some regional human populations completely while others, shielded by coastlines, favorable currents, or simple distance from the ash plume, rode it out largely unaffected. The genetic bottleneck could be the combined signature of both outcomes at once: a species that lost entire branches of its family tree in some places while barely stumbling in others. And this is where the story stops being about volcanoes and starts being about you. Every human alive today is the descendant of the groups that made it through that filter. Not the biggest groups, not necessarily the strongest, the ones that could adapt fastest when the environment turned hostile without warning. The ones willing to try unfamiliar food sources, like shellfish along a coastline nobody had fully exploited before. The ones who could cooperate closely enough to share scarce resources during years when the sky itself seemed to be working against them. That resilience did not disappear once the ash settled. It became the baseline setting of your species. Every time you adapt to a sudden job loss, a natural disaster, a global pandemic, you are running the same underlying software that got a tiny population of humans through one of the harshest environmental disasters in prehistory. You are, in a very real genetic sense, built from the survivors of a filter so narrow it nearly closed entirely. There is something worth noticing in how this debate has actually unfolded over the last 2 decades. It did not resolve in a single dramatic discovery. It resolved the way most real science does, slowly, through disagreement. Ambrose proposed a bold, sweeping explanation. Marian's excavations complicated it. The Lake Malawi sediment cores complicated it further. Each new dataset forced the theory to become more precise, more cautious, more honest about what the evidence could and could not support. That back and forth is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. A near-extinction event that almost erased an entire species is also, quietly, a case study in how science slowly claws its way toward the truth. One contradictory data point at a time. Scientists are still arguing about exactly how close that call really was. Was it one volcano, or a slow accumulation of ice age pressures stretched across tens of thousands of years? The debate itself is a reminder of how science actually works. Not a single dramatic headline, but decades of researchers checking each other's evidence, revising the picture, getting closer to the truth one excavation and one genome at a time. But strip away the uncertainty over Toba's exact role, and one fact remains untouched by any of it. At some point in humanity's deep past, our entire species narrowed down to a population small enough to fit inside a modern sports stadium. And somehow, against odds that should have ended the story completely, they didn't just survive. They became you.